Hey there, this is Ross Izzard, and this is the Backcountry Fly Fishing Podcast, where we talk about fly fishing in more interesting places during turnover. So I am getting ready to leave tomorrow morning, actually, for a big backpacking trip to a lake that has been on my list for, probably 4 years since I read about it in a book. The book's about secret places and lost lakes in Colorado. I can only find really one account of anyone ever fly fishing this lake. It sits at about 12,300 feet. It's 3 or 4 miles off trail and about 1,000 feet straight up a really, really nasty incline up onto a glacial shelf. And it's a pretty gnarly climb, and a pretty gnarly route to get there. But I am going to make a run on it this week. So stay tuned. Next week, I'll let you know whether I made it or not. Or if I don't do an episode next week, then you'll know that I fell down a crevasse and you won't be hearing from me again. But setting that aside and assuming that I'll be okay, because of course I'm going prepared, which is what we should all do, I'm really looking forward to the trip. And I'm looking forward to it in part because it's going to be an awesome trip and I get to do something really cool and cross something off my list, but also because of when I'm doing it. So it's the end of August, the very end of August. As I record this, that means that I will be taking this trip the first week of September, basically around Labor Day. And it is exciting for me because it is basically my last big high elevation trip of the year. You know, every year I push it. Sometimes it's the first week of September. Sometimes it's the second week of September, but it depends on weather and conditions. But normally, by this time of year, you're starting to get a little bit of a chill in the air. It's getting colder at night. Things are starting to look different. You might even maybe be starting to see the beginnings of color change at high elevations. And it's starting to look kind of like fall. And that means that it is officially what I call turnover season, right? So we've talked about shoulder seasons, spring and fall, obviously, but there's a really small additional season in there kind of buried between summer and fall, which I call turnover. And that is when you're starting to see the switch from summer to fall. And so we've talked a little bit about how to fish over the course of the summer. We've talked a little bit, or really kind of a lot, about how to fish over the fall, or through the fall, I should say. But we really haven't talked about this little turnover window, which really for me is like September and maybe the very beginning of October, but it's not very long. It's really just a few weeks before you switch over into proper fall fly fishing. But it's worth talking about because it is different, both in terms of where you go and in terms of how you fish. And we've been having some really interesting interviews here for a bit. We've talked about a whole bunch of stuff this season that is at least fishing adjacent. But I want to go back to talking about fishing as we round out the season with our last full episode about this crazy backcountry fly fishing thing before we close out next week and take a little break while we wait for the beginning of season 5. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about fly fishing and specifically backcountry fly fishing during turnover season. And in classic fashion, I'm going to run through this in a series of buckets. In this case, really 5 different buckets that we ought to talk about. We will probably cover all of these in more detail at some other point, but I want to give you sort of a one-stop shop of how to think about the next few weeks of fishing as you wind down your summer and start looking toward fall. And these buckets are as follows. We got water and locations. That's the first bucket. So where do you fish? We've got timing, and related to that, weather, which is sort of a necessary component of what we're doing and where you go. You got gear, which is obviously very closely linked to timing and location and weather. And then we're going to talk about some of the nerdy stuff, like the way that the bugs and the flies change over the course of turnover season, because it does start looking different. And if you try to fish the same way you did during the summer, you might have a bad time. And if you try to fish the way you would over the fall or the winter, you might miss out on some really cool fishing. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about species, right? I mean, the fall is spawning time for some of our favorite species, and it's worth talking about how that impacts where you fish, how you shouldn't fish, and all of those things. So we're going to chat about those things. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into the first bucket, which is where you fish, your water and your locations. And I'm going to split this one up into 2. So you've got, on the one hand, still water, which in my world is pretty much high alpine lakes. And then you have obviously moving water. So, you know, streams, rivers, creeks, the good stuff, the traditional fly fishing water. And I want to talk about each in turn. So let's start with the lakes. Okay, so if you are like me, and if you live somewhere that has high alpine lakes, again, if you don't, then I'm very sorry for your loss. But for those of us who do, you probably spent a good chunk of your summer hiking up to these lakes, right? They're an awesome adventure. They're hard to get to. Not a lot of people go to them. They're stuffed with these amazing cutthroat, or sometimes brook trout, because we do love a brook trout. And in fact, this lake that I'm hiking to this week is only brook trout. So I don't care. I'll still go. I love them just the same. But you probably spent a lot of time doing this over the course of the summer. And if you're anything like me, no matter how much you hiked and no matter how much you fished, you really didn't even put that much of a dent in your list, right? So, I mean, I'm out there all the time. I've been fishing through a specific wilderness area this summer, as I do every summer. I've covered a fair amount of ground, but not even close to what I wanted to be honest, in part because there's just a lot out there to explore, in part because of work and professional stuff and personal stuff and other things and travel. Boohoo, I had to go to British Columbia for a little bit. And later on, I'm going to be going to Mongolia. And man, it's a hard life doing this backcountry fly fishing thing. But either way, regardless of the reason, I didn't get to do all the stuff I wanted to do. And that can be kind of tough when you start running up on the fall, because you have to start making decisions about where you want to go. And I'm going to kind of make this real easy for you out of the gate. You really need to be careful about going over, I'm going to say 11,000 feet, but I really specifically mean 12,000 feet and up down here in the Western U.S. after about the first week of September. It doesn't mean that you can't. You can certainly take a trip. I usually take a big trip over Labor Day week, as I am this week, but it does mean you need to start being pretty judicious about when you do that. And it means you're going to have to start watching the weather like enemy troop movements, right? You've got to really, really know what you're getting yourself into. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that here in a second. But to really lay it out, the nice thing about the backside of the summer is that usually the thunderstorms are starting to die off a little bit, right? Daytime temperatures are a little bit lower. That usually means less convection. That usually means fewer storms in the afternoon. It doesn't mean no storms in the afternoon, so don't be stupid up there. But it does decrease the likelihood of you getting caught in a really gnarly thunderstorm the way you might if you were above 12,000 feet in, say, July at like 2 in the afternoon, which is a really bad idea. But that said, you still get weather. It's still the mountains, it's still unpredictable, and you still get precipitation. And the reason that it gets pretty hairy is that precipitation can pretty quickly start looking like winter weather. So, it may only be September, and it might still be 60 or 70 degrees down where you're from, or even warmer. But up there, it's starting to look different. It's starting to shift into fall. It's starting to shift even into winter. And you can pretty quickly find yourself in a snowstorm in September. And I know people scoff at me and they say, oh, that never happens, but it does. I mean, check out when the first dusting of snow happens on these mountains. Sometimes it happens as early as the end of August. Very often it's already happening in September. And that means that you have a real possibility of getting stuck in winter weather up there, which if you're not geared for it, can be extremely dangerous. Both because you could get disoriented and lost, and because of obviously the exposure risk that you would take by doing that. It gets slippery. You could have ice storms. You could have freezing rain. You could have boulder fields that are covered with ice. It starts to get pretty hairy. And the first time that you find yourself up in one of these locations in a storm like that, and yes, this has happened to me, just like all the stupid things you shouldn't do, I learned by doing them first. So you can at least take my word for it. But you're only going to have to do it once. I promise. It's not very fun. You're not going to have a good time. It can be pretty damn scary, and it's going to talk you out of being up there pretty quickly. You don't really need to have a lot of those experiences before you realize that you're being a ding dong. So really, when it comes to alpine lakes, this is kind of your last shot, right? So if you've got one more big backpacking trip or one more big hiking trip to one more lake that you want to see, your lake system, this first and second week of September are really your last shots to do it. Because after that, once we get into full-blown turnover season, you really don't want to be up there. And what's going to happen from a Stillwater perspective is you're going to start marching your way back down the mountain, right? So remember, in the spring, it's this progressive march that increases in elevation. You're going from lakes at 8,000 to 9,000 feet to lakes at 9,000 to 10,000 and 11,000 and 12,000 as they thaw out and the snow comes off and the ice comes off. And this is the reverse. You're stepping back down. So, by the end of the second week of September, you don't need to be hanging out at 12,000 feet anymore. You probably don't really need to be hanging out at 11,000 feet or anywhere above tree line at that point, to be perfectly honest. Maybe you can still get a couple days in at a 9 or 10,000 foot lake, which are still below tree line. And then you're going to start working your way back down. And pretty soon those lakes are either going to be inaccessible, or they're going to be dangerous, or they're going to be frozen. And you're going to be back down at lowland Stillwater for at least a while before those lakes freeze too. So as far as where to fish with alpine lakes, go squeeze that last little bit of juice out. Get your hiking boots on, put on your backpack, get those glutes ready to work, and go knock out one more lake, take your big trip, and then chill out and start fishing at lower elevation, because that is the way it is in turnover season. Now, when it comes to streams, it's a little bit different. Streams obviously tend to stay open longer than lakes do. The same elevation pieces apply here. So getting stuck in a snowstorm at 11,000 feet on a creek is not appreciably different as far as the impact on your safety and well-being from getting stuck at a lake under the same conditions. You still don't want to do that, so don't take this the wrong way. However, a lot of those higher elevation creeks will still fish reasonably well during turnover season. So, where you really need to be off those super high elevation, high alpine cirques by the middle of September, you can probably keep pushing decent elevation creeks. I would say probably right up to about 11,000 feet, as long as you're not being silly about it, right up through the end of September a lot of the time, until the weather starts getting nasty, the water temps start plummeting to a point where fishing is really not worth it. I've talked about this before, but I think that happens at roughly, let's say 35 degrees, so right below 36 degrees. Once you get below that, the water's not frozen, but it's cold enough that those fish are lethargic, their metabolisms are functionally dead, and they're not doing much. They're just hanging out. So you've got a little bit of time to do that, and that leaves it open for you. But also keep in mind that a lot of these higher elevation creeks and streams, or even really just generally a lot of the backcountry creeks and streams, are starting to get pretty skinny at this point. So, a lot of the lowest water levels of the year happen in the fall, especially on freestone creeks and streams that are not moderated by dams, because there's just not a lot of water coming into the system, right? Runoff is over. There's not a lot of snowmelt coming in anymore. Even the last little bits of snowmelt have come through. And so these streams are starting to get pretty low. Some of them cease to exist. And yes, I have fished streams that will do really well in July and August. And by September or October, they'd still be fishable technically from an environmental temperature perspective, but there's like no water in them. And the fish are all concentrated in these really deep pools where, they're stressed, they're isolated, they're concentrated, and it would be borderline unethical to go and fish for them. And so those creeks and streams come off the table. They're not viable anymore. Others will get so low that they're still fishable, but you need to be thinking about how you fish them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a little bit. But, keep in mind that these things are going to start closing down on you. And as they do, the same thing's going to happen. You're going to be marching your way back down the mountain in elevation, but you're also going to have to start really altering the way that you think about fishing, right? So in the spring, are the flows too high? Now are the flows too low? And so checking those flow stations, figuring out the water levels, really paying attention to the water itself and the way that those levels impact the fish and the ecology in the stream is going to help you make good decisions about where to go fish, not just to be productive and have an awesome day fishing, but also to be responsible to the resource and not be putting incredible amounts of pressure on these teeny tiny headwater streams where the fish are like fighting for their lives with very little water coming through. So keep that in mind. Do pay attention to the flows and really start thinking about water temp, right? So when you go up there, I do this no matter what. I always stick my stupid meat thermometer in there and get a water temperature literally every time I go fly fishing. But this is one of those times where it starts to get really important, especially if you're keeping a log, right? You can go up, stick it in there, and you're like, okay, it's 45 today. Still perfectly fishable. Maybe you go back the next week and it's 41. Still fishable, starting to get cold. Maybe another stream is 37 or 36 by the time you get into like first or second week of October. that might be your cue that it's time to start moving down to warmer stuff or go somewhere else. So it's going to be a learning process. Keep track of where you go, but do understand that, during the summer, all of these backcountry creeks and streams are available to you. You can go really almost wherever you want, as long as your legs can take you there. But once the turnover season rolls around, it's going to start looking different, and that's going to change where you fish. So start building that list of fall streams and creeks now, and rivers, I guess, but rivers are a little bit less susceptible to this. At least the big ones that are flowing through main drainage valleys that tend to be a little bit lower. And just start making your peace with it. It's going to look a little bit different, and that's okay. So you got your summer spots, start thinking about your fall spots, and that should help you find a good place to fish through turnover. Now let's talk about timing a little bit. And I'm going to talk about this specifically in the context of timing within the window of a day, right? So yeah, we could talk about when you should go to these places. You kind of already heard that from me. Second week of September, you're probably done at really high elevation alpine lakes. By the third or fourth week, you're probably done with most high elevation streams, if not before that. And so that means that, your general timing is over the course of September and the very first part of October, you're just going to see your options start to dwindle and get more limited. And that's okay. But as far as you're going to go fishing this day, there's a different timing rhythm that you need to be paying attention to there for turnover season. You're going to have to forgive me because this is probably going to come across as a little rudimentary, but it bears mentioning. The sun comes up later and goes down earlier during turnover season. I know that this probably shocks you, but here we are. I am consistently surprised by how many people do not pay attention to sunrise and sunset times. And that during the summer kind of doesn't really matter, right? Like dawn is at 4:30 in the morning and the sun's up at 5:15 and it's up until freaking 9 o'clock or 9:30. No big deal, right? The chances of you getting stuck somewhere after dark and having to be really cautious about your timing, they're not super high. The stakes are pretty low. The sun's up all the time and you're probably good. Some people carry that same mindset, I think because it's still warm and it still feels like summer, they carry it into turnover season. And that's a big mistake, right? Because while the sun might have come up at 5:15 back in early August or late July, now it's not coming up till 6:30, right? In the morning. So that means dawn is not till 6 a.m. And so that means if you roll up to the trailhead like you usually do at 4 in the morning because you want to get up to this awesome high alpine lake, it's still going to be dark when you start hiking. And that's okay, right? I mean, I hike in the dark all the time because I got to be up there and down before the storms roll in around noon. You guys all know that. But in this case, I think sometimes people get caught off guard because they try to go to the stream or they try to go to the lake and it's dark when they get there, or functionally dark. And that raises all kinds of issues, right? Number one, it's starting to get cold. So in some places when it's dark, it's pretty chilly during turnover season. In other cases, you might not have the right gear, like decent navigational stuff or a headlight to help you navigate that safely. You might trip and hurt yourself because slipping in the dark happens when you're hiking in the dark. You might not really have a great fishing experience, particularly if you're getting to a stream in the dark. A lot of times with those water temperatures starting to come down, you might get some, but there's just not a lot going on that early in the morning because you really need the sun to come hit those cooling waters, warm them up a little bit, get the bugs moving, and then get the fish moving. So it could cut down on your enjoyment. And then the backside of that is also true, right? So the sun goes down earlier these days, right? So that means that your timing there changes too. So you go from sunset times that are basically 9 o'clock and it's not really dark until, at 9:30, 10. I mean, sometimes I'm still out there and it's still light enough to see by 9:45 at night in the summer. Obviously varies by where you are in latitude. When I was in Canada, it was still light at midnight. So, the Northerners have it even better than we do. But the fact remains you got to be aware of the sunset time, especially if you're hiking, right? Because then all the same stuff happens in reverse. You might not have a headlight. You might not have the right navigational stuff. You might not have expected to be hiking in the dark. Those are dangerous things. And in some ways, they're even more dangerous when you're coming back down the hill, especially if you're covering elevation, because you're much more likely to fall and get hurt coming downhill than you are going uphill, right? You slip on a rock going uphill. I mean, that sucks. Maybe you bang your knee or whatever. I don't mean to minimize it. But you slip on a rock coming downhill, that could be a big thing. You could fall, break your tailbone, you could clap your head on another rock. I mean, a lot of stuff can happen. You really don't want to be hiking down ever in the dark. I don't think that's a good idea. You can hike up in the dark, but hiking down in the dark is not a good idea. And that means you need to be aware of sunset times. So don't go out there expecting your day to look like it did in July or August. Go out there, check the sunset time, check the sunrise time, know exactly how much daylight you have, and plan your hiking trip accordingly. Okay, don't get stuck out there. If you're going to be out there after dark, guess what? You're backpacking. Bring a tent, bring some food, bring water filters, bring a sleeping bag. You just go sleep out there. That's cool. It'll be cold when you wake up, like, possibly not far off of freezing. But that's okay. You'll be fine as long as you have the right stuff. Just don't get stuck out there without the right stuff. And that can very easily happen if you are not paying attention to timing. Related to timing is weather. Okay. And we covered a little bit of this with the first part about what you need to deal with and what you will deal with or could deal with at some of these high alpine lakes or really any high elevation location. But I think you also need to be paying attention to the weather sort of in general over turnover season, because it can get pretty weird pretty quickly. You can have days that are exceptionally warm and you can still get really violent thunderstorms. I find somewhat shockingly, and I don't know if there's somebody may have statistics that'll disprove me on this, but it seems to me that we tend to get a lot of cold fronts coming through right about the beginning of September and through September that can really make the weather kind of crazy. In some cases, it can make it rain for days on end. We just had one of those stretches here. In some cases, you just get this sort of low-level overcast, which isn't bad necessarily and isn't bad for fishing, but I don't like doing serious hikes under overcast, especially at high elevation, because I can't tell when it's going to turn into a thunderstorm, right? So when it's blue skies, it's not hard to look up and go, oh shit, that's a thundercloud. I should probably get to tree line. When it's overcast, that can be really difficult. And those storms can turn from being drizzly, gray, not very interesting, to being really bad situations pretty quickly. And so those kind of weird cold front overcast days can be tricky. And it can also mess up the fishing, right? So you've heard me talk about this a million times on here, but you also heard me talk to a dear friend from USGS who said he agreed with me, for the record, which makes me almost a scientist, that the pressure changes that come with these low pressure fronts will screw up the fishing big time, right? So that happens a lot in the spring. And that was the context that we talked about it in before. But it also happens in the fall. And so I find in the summer, it's pretty warm. Yeah, you get some fronts here or there, but it's not really going to change the fishing too much. Once you get into the turnover season, it will start to change the fishing. So when those cold fronts blow through, it's going to jack up the weather. It's going to make things weird and kind of unpredictable. It might make things cold, and it will start to affect the fishing. So you might not have been paying attention to pressure maps over the course of the summer. You might have just kind of forgotten about them. That's cool. Me too. I kind of stopped caring about them for June, July, and August. But now you got to start looking at them again. If you have a low pressure front coming in, a cold front coming in, you can still go fishing. Just be safe about it and understand that the fishing might not be quite what you hope for. So keep that in your back pocket. Now, as far as gear goes here, we can kind of go fairly quickly through this because not a lot changes, at least as far as your fishing gear goes, right? So I'm not really fishing different rods over the course of turnover season. I'm still carrying 4 weights, maybe 3 weights for creeks and streams. I'm still carrying a 5 weight and a 6 weight, preferably a 6 weight for high alpine lakes. That equipment doesn't really change, so we don't necessarily have to talk about that stuff. But what will change is the stuff that you need to have in your backpack. Okay, so during the summer, you might get away with just carrying a rain jacket and maybe like a really, really light like tech fleece thing in case it gets really cold up there. During this turnover season, you don't know what you're going to get. It could be 70 degrees one day and it could be 50 degrees the next day or 40 degrees the next day and raining. It can get really, really cold, really, really fast. As I mentioned earlier, you can get stuck in a snowstorm. Lots of things can happen. It gets funky up there during turnover season. And that means you got to carry some extra stuff, right? So yeah, you still got to have your rain jacket, mandatory all the time. You got to have a fleece with you, a light fleece that you can hike in and have on you just for basic warmth. But this is also the time of year when you really need to start thinking about potentially carrying like a mid-weight layer of some type. So it might be a puffer jacket, could be a heavier fleece, could be a heavier rain jacket, it could be Well, whatever. I mean, you get the drift. There are probably a million ways that you could think about that. But the gist of it is that you're probably going to have to add an extra optional layer to your kit for this stuff, because there is a possibility that you're going to get cold, really cold, not just like, ooh, I'm cold, I need to hike out, but actually cold and need to deal with it. So you need to start bringing that with you. And you probably need to start bringing that beanie with you, that hat to keep your head warm. Now, I carry that with me all the time. As you know, if you listen to the episodes about what I carry in my pack, I always have one of these with me because I'm bald and my ears get cold. And sometimes that happens even in the middle of the summer when the wind's ripping on you in some cirque and, whatever elevation. It gets cold up there. But it can get really cold pretty quickly during turnover season. And if you're going to be pushing your luck at high elevation, even if you're at tree line, it's going to get pretty cold pretty fast, and it might surprise you. So having a warm hat with you and a pair of warm gloves, it's really not a bad idea. You may not need them. You could probably go a decade without ever needing to actually touch those things. But if and when you ever get stuck in something out there, you're going to be really glad that you had some extra warm stuff with you. And that's why you ought to carry them with you at all times. You could probably get away without them for, I don't know, a year, 2 years, or 3 years and say, I don't need them. It's just extra weight and extra space. But eventually, if you were doing backcountry fly fishing at any kind of elevation in the turnover season, you're going to run into a situation where you're going to be glad that you had a warm hat and warm gloves. I promise. So take those with you. Same thing with base layers. If you suspect that it's going to get really cold out there, or that even it could get cold, bring a pair of wool base layer stuff, merino wool stuff, right? We talk about it all the time. That's my baseline for fishing in the wintertime. It's also kind of my baseline for fishing in the fall. And I will very often carry those with me, especially if I'm backpacking during turnover season, both as pajamas, because they're comfortable, and why the hell not? But also because having that warm wool base layer really does make a big difference for your comfort and your safety if the weather gets nasty and it starts getting cold. So you don't have to think too much about this. It's not rocket science, but you do need to start thinking about bringing at least a few extra warmth items with you. It'll change your life, might save your day, and one day it might save you from having a really bad time. So that's gear. Now, let's talk about bugs. Everybody likes to talk about bugs, right? At least everybody who fly fishes. And we're going to do the same thing we always do here. We're going to run through kind of each of the species, and I'm going to do it fairly quickly for you. We don't need to dwell too hard on the bugs, even though I'd like to. But I also am going to give you just sort of the general spoiler here, which is that there are not as many bugs during turnover season. Temperatures are coming down, both air temperatures and water temperatures. That does have an impact on the insects. It does impact what's hatching. And as a result, it does impact the fishing. So let's go ahead and jump in and talk about a few of these species. The first one is mayflies. Okay. And so there are like 20 gajillion species of mayflies. We don't have to talk all of them. And you're going to have some that start trickling off into late summer. So like you might have some of the lighter bodied mayflies, like a pale morning dun, that are still trickling into September, like the first couple weeks, but they're going to start to drop off pretty quick as things get colder. You will still have blue wing olives coming off, especially on really that are cold or cool, cloudy days, September and really even into October. And those are kind of small mayflies that we typically fish in the spring, but they'll still bring trout up to the surface. So they're a good option for going out and getting some dry fly action. The other one that we ought to talk about is trichos. Okay. And so people get kind of weird about trichos, but trichos are sort of one of the defining insects of the late summer and the early fall. So they're a little different than some of the other mayflies, but they do stick around with us through September. They usually kind of set in. I've seen trichos as early as July, but they'll hang out through early September and sometimes all the way through September. But really, I see trichos primarily on sort of warmer days. Okay, so most tricho hatches are in the morning. They happen usually when the water warms up a little bit. They tend to slow down as cooler nights set in, but most of your tricho hatches are going to be in the morning. And most of the folks who are fishing trichos, and trichos are tiny, we're talking like size 20 to even 24. I've heard of people fishing size 26, but fishing a size 26 dry fly makes me have nightmares, so I'm not going to be doing that. But, they come in and usually from like 8 to 10 in the morning, depending on how the temperature looks and how the water looks, you're going to see those trichos hatching. You're going to see spinner fall once they've mated and they die and they fall into the water. So the fish are coming up and gorging themselves on these little tiny spinners. And they are an important insect to pay attention to in turnover season, because if you're out there and you're slinging dry flies, you might not be able to get a trout to come up to like a size 14 Royal Wolf, but you might be able to get them to come up for a size 20 or 22 Trico. So if you don't have a couple Trico patterns in your box, you really should, especially for this turnover season, because they become pretty important, especially in the mornings, and they're not something that I would want you to leave off, because they really can make your day, especially in early September. Now, one more note about these. Tricos are typically gone from the freestones by, I don't know, let's say the third week of September. I've seen exceptions to that, but for the most part, they're done by then. But you might still see them on tailwaters, right? So if you're down fishing, I'm not going to name any, but pick a big tailwater, a bottom release tailwater where the water temperatures are more consistent, you may see Tricos hanging out through September and even into October. So it is worth you keeping those in your box next to those BWO flies and parachute Adams, and not forgetting about those as we head into September and then later on into October. Now let's talk about caddis flies. Caddis are definitely starting to chill out at this point. Most of the summer caddis species have sort of, tapered off. They're not as around quite as much. You'll still see caddis in September, especially I would say sort of warmer days in the afternoon, maybe even the evenings. There are certain species that are called October caddis, which are these really big sort of like orangey caddis that will pop up in October, as the name might imply, or even late September. So I don't mean to say that caddis are not around, but they start to become a little bit less important during turnover season. So if you've been throwing an elk hair caddis all summer, rad, me too, but you might start to notice that fly getting a little bit less productive as time goes on. And that means that you might need to start getting creative. Maybe it is time to switch over to a mayfly pattern, or maybe it is time to try something totally different. But you might not be able to get away with just slinging a elk hair or some other caddis pattern, X caddis, whatever, all the way through turnover season. You might have to start getting more creative, or you might have to start very selectively matching what type of caddis are still around to be effective as we get closer to that line with fall. Now, as far as stoneflies go, stoneflies obviously are not major factors on stillwater. So if you're a stillwater only person, you can ignore this. But on streams, they're mostly starting to peter out, right? So the big ones, which are like the golden stoneflies and the yellow sallies, the big hatches that people talk about, those are basically done by early fall. That's to say that there's none around, but like the big hatches, the famous hatches, they're basically not happening at this point. So you can sort of, doesn't mean you can't fish a stimulator or a chubby Chernobyl. Just understand that it might not be as productive for you as a real small BWO pattern if you're looking to dry fly fish. There are some species of sort of fall stoneflies that hatch sporadically through the fall, but they are not consistent enough, I think, to be worthwhile fishing. Now, I should mention this. You can always fish stonefly nymphs, right? So those nymphs live underwater for years, a year, 2 years, or even longer. And that means the nymphs are always productive. So don't let what I'm saying here talk you out of tying on a Pat's rubber legs or whatever. Stonefly nymphs are always great. And in fact, that's true for mayflies and caddis too. It might be slowing down, but that doesn't mean that the nymphs aren't bouncing around on there. So we're really kind of talking more about your dry fly and emerger patterns here. But as far as dry flies go, once you get into fall or turnover season, your stonefly fishing is starting to slow down. Yeah, you'll still catch fish on them. Yes, I still sling big foam flies in the fall because I'm a caveman and I like it, to be honest. But it is starting to slow down. And if what you're looking for is to catch a ton of fish, stoneflies on top might not be the best way to do that on most streams as those water temperatures drop off and the nights get colder. Then we've got midges, right? And I hate midges. I've said it a million times. I'm never going to not hate midges. I've gotten all your emails about you guys who love midges, and I think you're sick. I don't understand. They're terrible bugs. They're annoying. They're small. They get in your lungs when you accidentally breathe them in. You can't see the flies, and they suck. I hate them. But unfortunately, as we get into turnover season, midges are becoming very important. They're always important, unfortunately, for all of us, but they get really important during this season, right? So the same way that midges are sort of the staple food through the winter in a lot of these fisheries for trout, they are starting to come back in force as the mayflies and the caddisflies and the stoneflies taper off. Midges are still around. They hatch all the time. They never go away, no matter how much we want them to. And so they become very important. So you sickos who have like a Pat Dorsey style box with 50 different midge patterns tied in size 28 are in luck, because this is the first time of the year where I would say that it's worth it to start throwing those flies again. And those of you who don't have that kind of box, number one, thank God. But number two, you really should make sure you've got some midges in your box, even if it's just zebra midges or black beauties or top secret midges or whatever, or obviously Griffiths, gnats, blick. Make sure you tie a white wing on those so you can actually see them without going psychotic. But you need to start paying attention to midges, because they are probably going to be at least a very important aspect of your fly box during turnover season, and maybe the most important aspect of your fly box during turnover season. So don't forget the midges. And then we've got terrestrials. So this is, it's beetles and ants and grasshoppers and everything else, of course. But really for me, terrestrials are usually hoppers. Yeah, I'll throw a beetle every now and then. I don't remember the last time I threw an ant pattern, but I mean, people do, I guess. But they're still around, so you can still fish hoppers right up through, I would say, the very end of September. I've still had good luck fishing hopper patterns through the end of September, especially on lower elevation creeks and streams. But just understand that once the frost set in, so once you get that first hard freeze, and keep in mind that varies depending on elevation. It's obviously going to happen earlier at higher elevation. Then they're pretty much done. That's kind of the end of terrestrial season. So when you start seeing frost in the grass, you start hearing about freezes or any of that stuff, that means it's probably time to retire the grasshoppers and the beetles and the ants, if you're so inclined, for the season, and really start focusing on those other bugs. But at least for the very first part of turnover season, most of September, you can still get away with fishing terrestrials. And you guys know me. If I can throw a foam bug at a fish, I'm absolutely going to do that. So don't give up quite yet. Terrestrials still matter here, and I want you to keep after that, at least through the early part of this transition. And then we've got streamers. We're not going to talk about streamers. Streamers work all the time. If you have a lake that has not a lot of insect activity going on it, which happens often during turnover season, streamers are a great way to go. The old BSW, the bugger, scud, wet fly combo that I've talked about on here before will work great for you during turnover season, especially if insect activity is lower. So streamers are fine. They always are fine. If as long as the water is not frozen, you can fish a streamer and you might catch something. So we don't need to linger on that one. But at least as far as the main insects go, that should give you a good overview. And then finally, I want to talk about fish species. And we can go fairly quickly through this, because I know you guys are probably tired of me getting on the soapbox. But here is your friendly reminder. Brown trout and brook trout spawn in the fall. Okay, rainbows and cutthroat spawn in the spring. Brown trout and brook trout spawn in the fall. And that means that they are waiting for the water to hit a certain temperature. And once it hits that temperature, it's sexy time for them. Okay, so for brook trout, this is usually around, let's say, high 40s. So once you start seeing water temperatures that are dipping to like 47, 48, so something just below 50, you're going to see those male brookies get really vivid. They're going to get these really crazy fiery bellies and crazy blue halos and white tip fins, because they're trying to get a girlfriend, and they're going to start spawning. So once you start taking those water temperatures and you're in a brook trout stream or lake, and you start seeing water temperatures in those sort of high 40s, maybe even low 50s ranges, it's probably almost time for them to spawn. That's usually going to happen sometime in mid to late September, but sometimes it starts earlier at higher elevations. Keep that in mind. Brown trout, kind of a little bit later. So brown trout tend to like colder water when they spawn. They're usually going to start spawning in October, and then it'll last through November, and they have a lower temperature trigger. So they're usually waiting for their temperatures to get into like the low to mid 40s. So while the brookies might start spawning at like 47, 48, you're probably not going to see the browns start aggressively spawning until, let's say, 44, 45, 46. They start getting real aggressive. They get very territorial. They start getting hook jaws on them, and they start getting cool colors. And then they start building reds and chasing each other around, just like the brookies, and they're spawning. This is important for you to know, because it is not ethical to fish for spawning trout. I have had people send me letters telling me that I'm wrong about this. I've had folks try to argue it with me. And with respect, I think you're full of shit. If the trout are spawning, you need to leave them alone to spawn. The world already does not have enough wild trout or self-sustaining trout populations. We do not need to be messing with their spawn. We certainly don't need to be messing with the ecosystem or the rhythm of these waters. And so you need to leave them alone. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't fish at all, right? So you could have brown trout spawning in the same stream where you've got rainbows present, and that's cool. And you might even accidentally catch a brown trout, and that's okay too. Same with brook trout. You could have brookies coexisting in some places with cutthroat. Fine. Cutthroat aren't spawning. The brookies are. You're not targeting the spawning fish, and that's okay too. Where you get into trouble is if you go to a brook trout stream that is only brook trout and they're spawning and you're fishing for them, well, now you're kind of an asshole. And ditto for the brown trout. On top of being a not super duper smart asshole, because you're not going to catch a lot of fish doing that. They are distracted. They're doing something else. Spawning fish are not especially eager to eat your fly. And so you really got to work to catch them. And if you're really working to catch fish that you probably shouldn't be fishing for in the first place, you need to reevaluate your connection to the sport and maybe do some work to redevelop your respect for these fish, the resource, and the places where we fish. So be careful about where you fish and what you're fishing for during turnover season. As always, do not step on the reds. If you've never seen a fishing red, they look like a perfectly clean, hoovered off section of clean rocks on the bottom of the stream. They usually are in fairly shallow sections where a lot of oxygen can make its way to the eggs. Don't step on those. The fish lay their eggs in them, they fight over it, the males fertilize them, and then they sit there for a while before they hatch. And that means that if you go and step on them because you're not paying attention, you could accidentally kill hundreds of wild trout that you could be catching next season, or that I could be catching next season for that matter. So do not step on reds and leave those spawning fish alone. If you have a chance to go somewhere else, just go somewhere else, or at the very least, target something else. But please be respectful, guys. Anytime we're in spawning season, doesn't matter if it's the fall or the spring, you need to be respectful of these fish. And I really strongly encourage you to spend some time reading up on that and knowing what you're getting into before you pick where you're going to go fish during this transition season. And that pretty much covers it. That's not everything. Obviously, there's a lot more detail to go through here, but that should give you a pretty good map for how to fish this sort of tweener season. And I really hope it'll do you some good, because there's some awesome fishing to be had during turnover. Yeah, it looks different. Yeah, the places are a little bit different, but you can still get out there and have a blast doing this. And as long as you're responsible about it and you go prepared, you're going to do great. And honestly, it can be some of the best fishing in the year. So I hope you're going to get out there and get after it. I hope you've got one more good trip in you before those really high elevation places get locked up for the winter and start freezing up in the old ice prison. But regardless of that, I hope you're staying safe. Hope you're being good to yourself. And I will see you back here to close out season 4 next week. Until next time, this is Ross, and maybe I'll see you out there. I just hope it's not in a snowstorm.